Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Melissa, and today I'm making what I call my smocked sides dress. I call it that because it has two panels of smocking down either side, which add elasticity and allow the dress to slip on without needing a zipper. Now, this is my third version of this dress, and I'll be showing you how I do it, from modifying my basic pattern all the way to assembly. And I will try to be as detailed as possible just in case anyone wants to try and attempt this. However, I really wouldn't consider it a tutorial just because I've only ever done it for myself, and I just don't know what it might do when someone else is doing it with another pattern. And I will also be assuming that you have a general idea of how to smock, but if you don't and you want to learn, I do have an introduction to smocking video, which I will link in the description. So I start out with my basic bodice pattern, and there are a few important things to note about this pattern. First off, it only has center front darts. It does not have waist darts. It does not have side darts. And then the other thing is that this pattern specifically uses a side zipper, which means that the neckline is low enough to fit over my head, and that there is no seam on the center back bodice piece. In addition to that, I also have the stitch line marked out along the side seams, which is really helpful for my next step. So the next step is to overlap the side seams, lining up those stitch lines. I copied my pattern pieces a little odd, so you'll notice that I have one pattern piece with the printed side facing up instead of the grid side, and on that one I just folded back the seam allowance so that it was right onto that line for the stitch line. And then I just lined that fold up with the marked stitch line on the other pattern piece. And this essentially subtracts out that seam allowance, and you'll notice that it only lines up at the top. That's normal. That's basically, it only needs to line up at the top, and it wouldn't line up with the bottom anyway because the side seams of this pattern are not straight. So then I take a ruler and place it at the bottom of the armhole. Now you can see obviously the armhole curves quite a bit, but there at the bottom under your arm, there's going to be a spot that's pretty straight. And I'm just using the ruler to find that spot. And then I mark the beginning and end of it on the pattern pieces. Now I find that this is going to be a lot more of the line is going to be on the front bodice than the back bodice, and this has stayed true for I think every version I've done, and I have modified my basic bodice pattern a few times, so every time I've done it, that's been pretty normal. Then I extend those two lines that I marked straight down. And I don't adjust for the fact that the sides of the pattern are angled. I just leave these lines parallel to the side of the pattern that's being cut on the fold. Now these lines are my stitching lines, not the cutting lines. For the cutting lines, obviously, I need to add seam allowance. So I just measured 5/8 of an inch, which is my seam allowance, over from that line closer to the side edge, and drew a new line straight down. And of course did this for both the front and back pattern pieces. But before I can cut my pattern pieces apart to make my new pattern, I do need to check one more thing. So I need to line my pattern pieces back up the way they were before with the original stitch lines lined up. And then I need to measure the space between the two new stitch lines. So that's those first lines that I drew on each pattern piece. For me, it's 1 5/8 of an inch, and that's basically how much I'm taking off of these patterns, at least right under the arm. And of course then I need to add seam allowance to that, so that's seam allowance on two sides. That's 1 1/4 inches total. So add those two together for a total of 2 7/8 of an inch, which I wrote down and labeled as my insert pleated width, and I'm going to come back to that number later. And with that done, I can now go ahead and cut along those second lines that I drew to create my new pattern pieces. And believe it or not, that is all the modifications needed to be done to my actual pattern. And for me, really the easiest part, because the next part is doing all of the math for the remaining pieces of this pattern, which are all rectangles. So the remaining pieces are the front and back skirt pieces and the two side panels. So the easiest one to determine is the length of the front and back skirt pieces, and I just measured from my waist down to where I wanted the hem of the skirt to fall, added seam allowance plus 2 inches for the hem, and came up with 24 5/8 of an inch. Next was the front skirt width. I measured the front bodice waist from center front to the first dart leg, and then from the second dart leg to the side seam. Added those two numbers together and multiplied them by 2 to get the full front waist measurement. I then took that number and multiplied it by 1.5. I repeated the same process for the back skirt width. This was easier because it doesn't have any darts. For the side panels, I started out by calculating the width, and I just went back to the number that I wrote down earlier, the insert pleated width, and multiplied it by 3. This came out to 8 5/8 of an inch, and I just rounded down to 8.5 inches just to make things easier. Now for the length, I measured the side seams of both the front and back bodice pieces. And ideally these should have been the same number. However, for whatever reason, mine was slightly off, and the front bodice seam was just a little longer than the back bodice seam. So I just went with the longer number because I figure if it's too long on one side, I can always trim it down. It's a lot harder to add fabric if it's not there. So I took that side seam measurement and added the length of the skirt pieces. I then subtracted double my seam allowance because the side panels run the full length of the bodice and skirt, and therefore do not have a waist seam. With all of the pattern adjustments and measurements done, it was time to start cutting everything out. So I cut out 1 each of the front and back bodice pieces on the fold, and then used my rotary cutter to cut out the front and back skirt pieces as well as the 2 side panels. In addition to those, I cut out 4 pocket pieces, a facing for the neckline, and bias tape to finish the armholes. After cutting everything out, the first thing I did was pleat my side panels. And if anyone is trying to recreate this, then you just need enough pleating rows to run the length of the side seam on your bodice. This should hopefully give you an extra row to act as a holding row at the bottom. I would have used all of the rows on my smocking pleater, but evidently I had broken several needles and actually didn't have enough to fill my smocking pleater. So if you notice some gaps in my pleating, that's why. So once the panels came off of the pleater, I tied them off to the width of my insert pleated width, evened out the pleats, and ran some steam over them to hold them in place. Now it's time to smock. I don't do anything fancy for this. I just do rows of cable stitches right where the pleating threads are. And usually I pick a single color that blends in well with my fabric. This time I picked 2 different colors that still kind of blend in pretty well, and just alternated the colors. Now I do smock that top row. Normally this would be considered a holding row in smocking, but I find that it helps to have it smocked so that the pleats stay in place when I attach the bias tape later on. I also backstitched the bottom row of pleating, or of smocking, because the last time I did this style dress, I actually had that row really stretched out, and I'm hoping that having the back smocking in will help reinforce it and prevent it from stretching out, or at least from stretching out as much as it did the last time. Once the smocking was done, I went ahead and steamed the panels again just to block those pieces. Then I started the assembly. So I started by sewing the front bodice darts, then placed the front and back bodice pieces together and stitched them along one shoulder seam, and did the same for the neckline facing. I then sewed the facing to the bodice with right sides together along that neckline, and this allowed for the final shoulder seams to be sewn all in one go, so from the bodice and then straight across the facing shoulder seam as well. I then gathered and attached the front and back skirt pieces to the bodice pieces. I removed the pleater threads from the side panels and then attached these panels to the dress front along the side seam. Then I attached the bias tape around the armholes and attached the pocket pieces to the side seam of the dress back underneath right under the waist seam, and then to right under the smocking on the side inserts. And this puts the pockets close to where the side seams would be on any other dress that I would do with this pattern, because if you recall from the beginning, not a lot was taken off of the back bodice. I then lined up and sewed the side panels to the dress back, going around the pockets and through the bias tape. Then all that was left to do was to turn under and hand stitch the hem, the neckline facing, and the bias binding.